Okay, I think we're live. And today I just wanted to go through Surah 54, entitled Al Kamar, or the Moon. But before that, I just want to talk a little bit about the Christian Prince. Uh, I don't know if you would call it a debate. Calling it a debate is a real stretch linguistically. I don't think that qualifies as even an argument. It was basically Christian Prince. Hi, Scott. It was Christian Prince talking to a group of what they would call in Australia bogans. Just these weird this weird hybrid you have in the UK, which is a combination of an obnoxious Salafist Muslim, but uh, in terms of philosophy, having that philosophy and ethnicity transplanted on onto someone with uh, a Cockneyish lower class English accent because their family grew up in Great Britain, even though they're not English. Uh, Kind of like the Ali G character Sacha Baron Cohen portrayed, um, a lower to lower middle class Muslim Arab living in England. But basically, a group of these guys, Ali Dawa and Mohammed Hijab, who you're probably familiar with because I uh, talked about them when I did my videos about the debate, quote unquote, at York College between him and he and David Wood. And just like this, it wasn't quite as chaotic, but it really was a circus. David Wood came there prepared to have an honest intellectual debate about the topic of Tawheed and Trinity and the contrast between the two. And Muhammad Hijab turned it into a circus. And one of the problems with people like this is that just Dawa and general Muslim apologists, they don't know what being an apologist means, and they don't know what a debate means. It's not about these theatrical flourishes or trying to act like a uh, trying to act like a buffoon. The idea is to articulate in the most cogent manner your argument and to persuade the audience of the validity of that argument. It's not to play to the crowd or the peanut gallery, which in most cases for Mohammed Hijab is just a group of equally ignorant or more ignorant Muslims who don't understand exegesis, and they don't understand the Bible, and they don't even understand their own book, the Quran. So he kind of caters to this crowd, and that's what you saw in the Mohammed Hijab Christian Prince debacle. But the problem was it was a debacle for Mohammed Hijab and his cohorts because Christian Prince was recording all of this, and you can actually find it on his channel, and it was mirrored on dozens of other websites, YouTube channels rather, and you can find Mohammed Hijab just embarrassing himself and not being able to answer the most simple question. One of the videos done by another Muslim Dawa guy on YouTube, and I can't recall the name, but I watched this 11-minute video, and it was kind of interesting because even he conceded that Mohammed Hijab embarrassed himself. But one of the interesting things that he brought up was the fact that Christian Christian Prince brought up Yasin, Surah 36:14, the verse which alludes to the Apostle Paul and he said this was ridiculous. This had nothing to do with the Apostle Paul, because it undermines the entire argument used by Muslim apologists that Paul was some sort of usurper. He had no relationship to Jesus Christ, that he wasn't a true apostle. The fact that Muhammad describes Paul in this verse, and let me just, I don't think I have it here, but he basically describes him and another man, and they're messengers of Allah, and they're chastising idol worshippers. But the fact that Muhammad describes Paul in this manner, and you can find it in Tafsir ibn Kathir, a description of Paul. This is an explanation of that ayah, which according to, um, if if you look at it, it's a description of Paul, and it basically undermines the entire Muslim approach, which is that the Gospels were corrupted by Paul. So when you read the Pauline epistles, a description of Jesus as the Christ and his resurrection, all of this is just things that were added by Paul, and it's a corrupt version of the gospel, and this completely undermines that. But this Muslim YouTuber was claiming that it's simply lies. He didn't really offer any substantive explanation as to why it was incorrect. The default option for a lot of these people is to say, "Oh, these people don't understand the true Arabic." In Arabic, it doesn't say. But again, it's nonsense. It's just a justification for them to avoid addressing something that completely undermines their entire argument against Christianity and against the New Testament. Hi, Mary. Thanks. And he basically said, "This is nonsense. This is not Paul." But even taking into consideration this objection, and let's say for the sake of argument that they're right and they're not right, but let's, for the sake of argument, say they're right and that this isn't a description of Paul, they're still wrong, because Muhammad in other parts of the Quran says that Jesus' disciples were bearing the truth, that they were messengers of Allah, and so forth. So the fact that Paul was a disciple of Christ, by inference, that means that he was bearing the truth. And this goes back to a statement that David Wood said: Muslims, they can either believe the Quran, in which case their prophet was a false prophet and their religion is wrong, Islam is false, or they can disbelieve the Quran, in which case all those things hold true. So it's either way, you can either affirm the Quran or reject the Quran, but in either case, Islam is still false. The precepts are, that precept remains the same. Islam is false, whether you affirm or reject the Quran. And this goes to the heart of the internal contradictions of the book itself. But more to that point of exegesis, you shouldn't trust Muslims for exegetical discussion of either certainly not of the Bible, because they haven't read it and they don't understand it, but also not of the Quran. They're not good exegetes. They don't understand what they're dissecting. It doesn't matter if they know Arabic, even if they know classical Arabic, the language in which the Quran is written. I still wouldn't trust their exegesis, because they won't accept the simple fact, the fact that Muhammad said messengers of or disciples of Jesus were legitimate. Muslims are relying on Muslims are the worst people to rely on for exegesis, short of going to a Jehovah's Witness. I would not rely on them for any sort of critical exegesis, because it states explicitly in the Quran you're not allowed to do that. In fact, questioning Muhammad or questioning imams is strictly forbidden. People, particularly Christians, but particularly Calvinists, really love to trash Beth Moore and excoriate her. But I would go to Beth Moore 100 times before I would go to the most skilled Muslim apologist or the most um or the most learned Muslim scholar. I would go to her 100 times before I would go to that person um for an explanation of scripture. And again, I wouldn't trust them to delve into Muslim texts either, because they're they're inherently unable to grapple with these thorny issues, these things that cut against the grain of Muslim thought or that critique Muhammad's worldview. They're simply not. It's not in their constitution, if they really subscribe to the Quran, to go and critique and analyze the Quran from a critical perspective. It's impossible for them to do it and remain faithful, devoted Muslims. So that those are just my thoughts on the Muhammad Hijab Christian Prince fiasco. It was a fiasco for Muhammad Hijab, from Christian Prince's perspective and the perspective of Christianity. I think it was useful, just as the debate at York College, which I attended, was useful, in that it exposed the idiocy of Muslim apologetics, and it exposed the idiocy of Islam. If you think that this is a one-off or this is an aberration, Muhammad Hijab is typical of Muslim apologetics, and he's pretty much the best you're going to do when it comes to Islamic apologetics. Like, well, I mean, Shabir Ali is a much more dignified person. He actually understands the parameters of a debate. He understands basic basic things like logic and argumentation. So, in a sense, he would be a better apologist, but he is also very heterodox, and Muslims hate him for that reason, that he actually understands uh, rationality and argumentation, and he approaches a debate the way that someone who is a non-Muslim would. So they really can't stand that. And he also has very heterodox views on Islam itself. So some Muslims wouldn't consider him to be a real Muslim. They would execute takfir on him. But he's, in terms of a Muslim debater, Shabir Ali is pretty decent, but even he is working with very poor raw material. So it doesn't matter if you look to a good Muslim debater or a bad one. I mean, Zakir Naik and Muhammad Hijab, people who aren't Muslims already, are look at these people as an embarrassment. But that is what Muslim apologetics amounts to. You're not going to find more. You're not going to find a more persuasive or convincing case for the Quran or for Muhammad than you will with those people. And the Christian Prince fiasco is just an illustration of that. So, Surah 54, Al-Qamar, the moon. This is again right next to, subsequent to a surah entitled the Star. So another surah named after 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 part of the sky, a created thing. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. And this surah is about an event that Muhammad claimed proved he was a true prophet and proved the divinity of Allah, namely the fact that the moon split in half. Now you have to understand, this was someone who didn't understand anything about astronomy. When a solar eclipse happened, the moon cast its shadow over a portion of the earth, and he believed that was a sign that the apocalypse was imminent, that judgment day was about to happen. So literally a a rare but routine event, astronomical event. He attributed that to Allah he thought he was going to die the judgment day. He saw an eclipse, and that's the conclusion he drew. That's how ignorant he was of just basic science and astronomy. Yet we're going to rely on him for an account of the moon splitting open, and going to rely on that account and trust it. It's simply ridiculous. But this is what the story is about. The hour drew nigh, and the moon did rend asunder. This is something he's saying happened. This is not some sort of metaphorical or figurative interpretation that we're going with here. He's saying the moon split asunder, and he's not referring to an earthquake. He's saying the moon was rent in half. He's saying this is something that actually happened in the past, and this is a proof of Allah. And if they see a miracle, they turn aside and say, transient magic. And they call it a lie. That's because it was a lie. This didn't happen, and follow their low desires, and every affair has its appointed term. And certainly some narratives have come to them wherein is prevention. Consummate wisdom, but warnings did not avail. So he's saying these people who are skeptics of something that did not occur are liars, that they're simply spreading, that they're simply misrepresenting what happened, that the moon really did split in half. Again, there's no evidence that this ever occurred. So turn your back on them for the day when the inviter shall invite them to a hard task, their eyes cast down, going forth from their graves as if they were scattered locusts. And this is an interesting verse, because locusts actually are a huge problem in the Middle East, and this is why they were used as a reference point in the Bible. And you had plagues of locusts as a sign from God, as a sign of judgment upon disobedient Israel, but also Israel's captive. So locusts were extremely important, and they're still very, very feared in the Middle East. In fact, there was a wave of locusts that came down on Mecca during Ramadan. It was really funny, and not the attack of locusts, but it was ironic that during this holiest of pilgrimages, this obligatory pilgrimage that Muslims must make, the Hajj, a wave of locusts came into Saudi Arabia, into Mecca, and attacked the assembled crowds. And this is something that happens. This is not a one-off. This is something that happens, that has happened in the past. And in the Bible, it's referenced. Let me just skip to Job, the book of. Give me a second. Yeah, in the book of Job, there's something that's referenced the locusts, restoring what the locusts have eaten. So locusts are an important, are very important in the Middle East, both in the past and even in recent history. So he uses this term, their eyes were cast down, going forth from the graves as if they were scattered locusts. So the idea of locusts is synonymous with death and destruction and eating your livelihood, desolation, both to an individual, to your farmland or your food stores, but also to a nation. Locusts devouring a nation. Hastening to the inviter, the unbelievers say, "This is a hard day." Before them, the people of Nah rejected. So they rejected our servant and called him mad, and he was driven away. And this is an interesting verse, because it makes it sound like Noah was persecuted like all of or almost all of the prophets in the Old Testament, excuse me, as well as the New Testament. John the Baptist was imprisoned and beheaded, but it makes uh, there are prophets that were sawn in half. One was killed on his way to the temple. They were persecuted and mocked and reviled, just like Jesus was. So it makes it sound like this was um, this was what happened to Noah, rather than Noah and his family being rescued, being saved by God, uh, before God judged the world. So it's a really weird phrasing. Uh, he was driven away, as if they exiled Noah. It's just a very weird phraseology. Therefore he called upon his Lord, I am overcome. Come thou then to help. So we opened the gates of the cloud with water pouring down, and we made water to flow forth in the land in springs. So the water gathered together according to a measure already ordained. And we bore him on that which was made of planks and nails. This is a reference to the ark. But again, like most things in the Quran, there's no specifications. If you actually, there's no description of why this happened, why the world was being judged, why there was a flood, even though this is something that's clearly explicated in scripture. If you go to Genesis, so in Genesis chapter 6, it says, and it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And it continues in verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air. For it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So here you have a description of what actually happened and why the world was being judged, why Noah was saved, Noah and his family. But in the Quran, you have none of that. And you're expected to rely on Muhammad as a reliable narrator, despite the fact that he knows nothing about the biblical narratives that are rendered in the Quran that he's recounting. He just says Noah was rejected and he was driven away. So they opened the gates of the cloud, and there's a description of the flood. But there's no description of why this happened. A Muslim reading the Quran will have no clue as to why the earth is being judged, what precipitated this, what events happened before, and they'll have no idea of why Noah was being saved. They'll just say, "Oh, he called upon the Lord," and that's it. But there's no description of that, and there's also no description of the ark. So in chapter 7, he describes the flood and and um and and an actual description of the flood. What happened? The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth and all the high hills. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. So it says, according to a measure already ordained. Again, there's nothing in the Quran that would lead you to believe that Muhammad actually has an accurate understanding of scripture, much less that he has some sort of divine revelation from God. And yet that's what Muslims expect you to believe, when reading the Quran itself refutes that. Hi, Love and Light. Sailing before our eyes a reward for him who was denied, and certainly we left it as a sign. But is there anyone who will mind? How great was then my punishment, my warning? And certainly we have made the Quran easy for remembrance. But is there anyone who will mind? And again, this is just something. The Quran makes these assertions, and there's no justification for them. Now, it's easy to remember in the sense that the Quran arrived at a time before Arabic was a written language, really. That's one of the reasons the Quran is so esteemed, in part because it's one of the first real books we have written in Arabic. The Arabs were a nomadic people, a nomadic culture. They were not a literate people. They told stories through they passed down stories through oral tradition, poetry, and legends and folklore was communicated through oral tradition, just like the Homer's Odyssey, the Odyssey by Homer. Um, this was something that was passed down orally. So when Muslims brag about the fact that they can memorize large passages from the Quran, a large number of surahs, and can recite it from memory, there's nothing really impressive about that because they come from a culture where this is expected and where this is drilled into your head from a young age. Nabil Qureshi discusses this in his memoir, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. The fact that that he took personal pride in memorizing all of these verses when he was a young boy, 5 and 6 and 7 years of age. He and his sister, although his sister wasn't as adept at this, but the fact that he was able to memorize these verses and being a hafiz, being able to remember all of these things and recite them is impressive. But it's impressive from their perspective. But from our perspective, it really isn't, because first of all, you're reciting things that you don't understand. You're memorizing this by rote, a language that you don't understand. You don't understand the grammar or the syntax or what you're saying. You just memorize it and then recite it. It's not impressive. Being able to recite, let me put it this way, being able to recite the cow or al-Baqarah, one of the longest chapters in the entire Quran, that is less impressive than a Christian being able to give you a persuasive exegesis of Philemon, Paul's epistle to Philemon, or second or third John, even though these are the shortest books in the entire Bible. That is more impressive than being able to recite the long passages from the Quran. It's the equivalent of, there was I think there was an English Scrabble player who entered a Scrabble tournament in Germany, and he won it despite the fact that he did not speak German and he couldn't understand German. He simply took a German phrasebook or lexicon and memorized it by heart, the entire book. So he was able to beat all of the native German speakers. To me, that's the equivalent of what Muslims do with the Quran. They're able to memorize large passages in a language they don't understand. No, it's more impressive, and generally speaking, being able to recite by rote something in a language you don't understand is not impressive in terms of being an intellectual accomplishment, but it's certainly not impressive in terms of communicating the idea that you understand the text. It's not impressive at all. It's simply not, and there's no way around it. That so when this passage, let me just read it again. We made the Quran easy for remembrance. That doesn't say anything about I'm not saying Arabic-speaking Muslims obviously understand Arabic, but the thing is that is less than a quarter of the Muslim population. The fact, so they obviously have a better understanding than the other eight, the 3/4 of Muslims who don't speak Arabic. But those people don't understand it. So being able to recite it is not a sign that you have any comprehension of the text. So, I mean, you can argue this to your blue in the face. It's simply an ineluctable fact that being able to recite something by rote. Again, I'm not trying to poo-poo memorization. Improving your memory is is something that is good, generally speaking. Particularly when as you grow older and your brain starts to your brain functions start to diminish. Reading and memorizing things, it's not a bad thing, generally speaking, but it's not an indication that you actually understand what you've memorized and recited. Again, like being able to provide a persuasive exegesis of Philemon or Second or Third John is a lot more impressive and a lot more worthwhile than being able to recite by rote the cow or even these chapters, these shorter chapters like the moon, the star. It simply is. Muhammad didn't write Arabic. That is the merit. Yeah, well, I mean that's the argument that Muslims use, that he was illiterate, that he didn't understand the language, and the fact that he compiled this book is was miraculous. But when you actually read the book, you understand just how not miraculous it is, because it's completely. Yes, I'm saying they don't understand it. If you're 5 years old and you're listening to someone a muezzin scream in another language, and you're just memorizing those words, yeah, it's not it, it's completely fruitless. And the apostate prophet, I think, talked about this, and Abdullah Samir also have talked about this, how much brain energy is wasted when you think of how much time Muslims spend listening, going to a mosque and listening to the muezzin and listening to these Arabic, even if they do understand it, listening to these completely nonsensical and internally contradictory passages from the Quran, just hours and hours imbibing this and then regurgitating it. When you think of how much brain energy is wasted, it's remarkable, particularly when you look at countries like Pakistan or Egypt, these dysfunctional societies where people could actually be putting their intellect towards something useful instead of memorizing, or especially countries like Indonesia or Malaysia where they don't even understand the language. How much energy, how much intellect is wasted when it's preoccupied with this nonsense, just remembering things from a book which has no spiritual nourishment, which has no real value, and then regurgitating it. Forget about, put aside for a moment the malign impact it has on non-Muslims and on the rest of society in terms of jihadism, but just on Muslim societies itself, just the amount of intellectual brain drain, the amount of intellectual torpor this instills is astounding. Yeah, and it's impressive. A hafiz is looked upon with very high esteem in the Muslim world, so it's something to brag about. Again, it just goes to show you that Islam has a completely misguided view, because this is something that's condemned repeatedly in the Gospels by Jesus himself. Um, it has no value because the Quran has no value. It has no spiritual nourishment, and like I said, even if you're not enlisting in jihad, even if you're not spreading violence, the fact you're wasting your life. John Piper wrote a great book entitled um, "Don't Waste Your Life," and it was based on a conversation he overheard his father, who was also a pastor, having with a man who was elderly, and he wound up getting saved that night in church, but he just kept saying, "I've wasted it, I've wasted it," and this led this sparked something in John Piper, um, a spiritual journey. And after he had become a pastor, years later, he wrote this book called "Don't Waste Your Life," and that's the premise of the book: not wasting your life. And and this thing, and I know this is a long tangent, but it's important to make this clear. This is a wasted life if you spend your entire life. Now, for people like Abdul Murray and and Al Fadi, who you can use the Quran in their apologetics. They can use the Quran to reach out to Muslims to rescue them from Islam. Now that it's useful, it was useful for them. It's very useful, and God uses it um, in their vocation. So in that sense, it's useful. But someone who is born and dies a Muslim, it's a complete waste. It's a completely wasted life, and the time they spent memorizing the Quran could be put to so much better use. Um, again, this is an argument. I don't think John saw my video, but I did a video addressing all of these arguments, particularly the one. This is basically the argumentum ad populum, the argument from or appeal to popularity. In other words, if a lot of people believe something, then that means it's true, and it has some use in inductive reasoning. So, like, if you had a survey where 100 people, if you surveyed 100 people and 99 or 100 of them used a specific brand of toothpaste, then you could use the appeal to popularity, or argumentum ad populum, argument to popularity. You could use that to say, well, the next person is probably going to use this toothpaste, but that's the only situation in which that argument would be relevant. It's a logical fallacy. It's a logical fallacy to say that because a lot of people believe something, that means it's true or it has some relevance, or they're right and you're wrong. And again, it's also not scriptural. Um, I mean, because if you rely on the Bible, your refrain should be, if God uh, be with us, then who can be against us? Like, who can lay a charge against God's elect? Um, the elect is a minority group. It's not the majority of people. So again, whether you're relying on scripture or not, it's still a logical fallacy. So I think I'll end it there. I have like about maybe a page and a half left, but I'll finish that in my next video. I didn't mean to get off on a long tangent. I just wanted to address the Christian Prince-Mohammed Hijab encounter a little bit, and then um, that verse, because I think that's an important issue, and it's something that Muslims invoke a lot. And again, this is just another fallacious argument. This idea that being able to memorize things in a culture with oral that focuses on oral tradition is impressive or particularly relevant. It's not. And I just wanted to address that. But thanks for everyone for coming, John, Up with God, Scott, Irene, Love and Light, Mary, moderators, as usual, doing a great job. Don't forget to share. I'll see you all next time.